I mean, I think it's a good question, and ultimately everyone bears a little bit of responsibility, I think, in all, governance situations. But I do think the buck stops ultimately with the government in terms of making sure when you're dealing with taxpayer dollars in particular, whether it comes from provincial or federal sources or whether it comes from property tax revenues or other mechanisms, it's at the end of the day, it's your job to spend the money effectively, and to use it wisely, and to also determine and set those taxation levels too. So I think, businesses absolutely have a role to play in Canada, as do individuals. But, ultimately municipal governments and other levels of government, the buck stops with them, and they are ultimately the ones who are accountable to the people, in terms of what you're spending and what you're doing.
Welcome to Municipal Affairs. Today we're diving into one of the most important yet often overlooked questions in local governance. Are we getting good value for our municipal tax dollar? A new report from the Fraser Institute has brought this question into sharp focus. The study, The Expanding Finances of Local Governments in Canada, reveals that municipal government spending across the country has hit near record levels in recent years. Between 2000 and 2023, inflation adjusted per person municipal spending increased by over 25%, peaking at nearly $6,000 per resident in 2021. Revenues, too, driven by property taxes and intergovernmental transfers, rose by more than 33% over the same period. So, with all the money flowing into and out of city halls across Canada, we have to ask the simple question: has the quality of local services kept pace? Is public transit more reliable? Has homelessness declined? Are our streets safer? And are taxpayers truly getting what they're paying for? At the same time, while municipalities have been spending more, they've, according to the report, actually had the slowest growth rate of any level of government over the past decade. So, what's really going on behind the numbers? Today, we're joined by Jake Fuss, Director of Fiscal Studies at the Fraser Institute. Jake is here to unpack the findings, challenge prevailing narratives about municipal finances, and help us better understand what's truly driving local government's growth and what it means for taxpayer, policymakers, and the future of our cities and municipalities. So if you're ever looked at your property taxes bill and wondered, where is all this money going? This episode is for you. So stay with us, as this is Municipal Affairs. Jake, thank you so much for sitting down with me and talking about the Fraser Institute's most recent report back in June, The Expanding Finances of Local Governments in Canada. Very simple question to kick off the conversation. What was the key findings from this report?
Yeah, so what the report essentially shows is that municipal government spending on a per person inflation adjusted basis is near record levels right now. So the latest data year that we have available is 2023, but we've seen a pretty consistent trend of increasing spending since 2000. Municipal government spending on per person basis has increased by about 25%. And at the same time, operating revenue is increasing quite fast as well. On a per person basis, it's also increased by about 34%. So it's actually increasing even faster than government spending right now. But that's ultimately, the main takeaway is that we're seeing actually near record levels of municipal government spending currently.
And why is that, do you believe?
Well, I think it's driven by a few factors. So if we look at, some of the increases in spending over time, about 36% or so of municipal government spending is due to compensation for employees. Then there's other categories as well, in terms of the use of goods and services, which constitutes a lower proportion, around one-fifth or so of government spending. And then the final proportion is due to other factors. So all other expenditures, whether that's grants, subsidies, social benefits, that are happening at the municipal level. But it's not unique just to municipal governments. We're also seeing, increases in provincial spending and federal spending across the country, that are actually increasing even faster than municipal government spending. And that doesn't mean that municipal spending isn't increasing fast. It just means that all three levels of government right now are really accelerating, and putting their foot on the gas pedal right now when it comes to that expenditure.
So, as we are a municipal show, we have municipal leaders who listen to this show and watch this show on a regular basis from coast to coast to coast. One thing I often hear is we are the government of proximity. If there's something that's not happening in our community, we are the responsible ones who have to take it upon ourselves to offer that service, offer that program, do what the federal government or provincial government has, in their words, not mine, neglected to do. How do you how do you square the peg to say while spending has increased, it has also benefited the community as well, or has it not benefited the community in their increased spending? Because you talk about the three areas where you're seeing the increased spending. Is the service there that we're providing, or is there other things that we should be looking at as well?
I think that's a really good question because it's not just about how much you're spending, but it's also value for money and the services you receive. So municipalities absolutely do offer important services. You know, the water we drink, for instance, is coming through municipal services, police, roads, all of these really important aspects. But I think, when you look at some of the available evidence, even though it is up to Canadians to decide whether or not they're getting value for those dollars, commute times have barely budged in the last decade or so. Public satisfaction with public transit or roads really hasn't improved much at all when we're looking at polls and reports. There's all these different factors. Property crime and violent crimes are up since 2014. So even though they were previously at historic lows, they're now actually increasing. In some cases, Canadian municipalities now have higher property crime or violent crime rates than some comparable American cities as well, which is definitely a concern. Canadians can ultimately decide if they're getting that value for their tax dollars. But I would say right now there isn't a whole lot of evidence that we're getting that value for all this increased spending that we've done over the last number of decades. Is housing more affordable in these cities? Is it safer? Is homelessness, less of a problem than it was before? I don't think the evidence really points to that. I do think there's a lot of room for improvement at the municipal level right now.
Is there a province that's doing it better than others?
I mean, it's a good question. That part of the problem with comparing provinces in terms of municipal spending and revenue and the results that we're getting is that many municipalities have different spending powers or different taxation powers depending on where you live. So if we look at Ontario, for instance, that is generally the jurisdiction that has higher rates of operating revenue per person because they have different powers that are granted to them by the province. Whereas if you look at an Atlantic province, for instance, an Atlantic municipality, they're generally among the lowest per person spending and per person revenue jurisdictions in the country, simply because they have different responsibilities on public transit, infrastructure, and a lot of other municipal functions than an Ontario municipality or an Alberta municipality might have. So I'm always a little bit skeptical when people compare municipalities across the country, just because they don't necessarily have the same taxation powers or spending responsibilities as others. We can obviously look at the data and compare them a little bit, but I don't think it's necessarily an apples to apples comparison. And there's really, fiscal waste and high spending really across the country, regardless of jurisdiction, which is, I think is the other related concern here too.
Where is the waste coming from, do you believe?
I mean, it's a good question. I mean, ultimately, I mean, we've seen this at all three levels of government. If compensation for employees and bureaucracy is increasing, but you're not actually getting better services or programs necessarily, I think that's a problem that certainly needs to be addressed. But we can look at some municipal examples too of fiscal waste. One of my colleagues, Austin Thompson, who's a senior policy analyst in our municipal center, has pointed out in the town of Cochrane in Alberta, an ordinary park bench costs between $5,000 to $7,000 for each of these benches, which actually shocked a lot of the town councilors there. In the case of the Vancouver area, they had a major wastewater treatment plant that was originally only supposed to cost them about $700 million. It ended up costing them nearly $4 billion at the end of the day. So they weren't even hitting those targets even remotely close. And there's plenty of other examples. If you look at Ottawa with their light rail transportation network, there's huge cost overruns, huge technical challenges. So it's not necessarily that, we don't need some of these initiatives. It's that they're not being administered properly. They're not using taxpayer dollars wisely. And they're not actually spending the money effectively and efficiently. And at the end of the day, when those, boondoggles happen or other things, then they're ultimately coming back to taxpayers asking for them for more money or asking for provinces or federal governments to give them more money for all these programs rather than managing it a lot more efficiently and effectively.
Can I challenge you a little bit on that, if you don't mind me?
Sure.
Do I speak to mayors, and I'm assuming when this report was written, you chatted with the municipal sector as well, not just just pulling numbers out of the air. But when I speak to mayors and councillors, I often hear the same thing over and over again. The cost of doing business in municipalities is up because, and this is not Chris, this is what I'm hearing, businesses know they can get the money from municipalities. And when the bidding tender goes out, the municipalities have to go with the lowest bidder or with the bidder who successfully adheres to all the RFP requirements. And we're seeing more and more businesses saying, hey, it's a business, it's a municipality, it's the government. So they have unlimited supply of money. So does the business community also have to take a role in understanding that they can't be asking for the amount of money that they're asking? Or is it the municipality's responsibility to ensure that the money that they're spending is spent wisely? And if it's not, then you need to challenge the businesses on saying, why are you not offering the service that you've guaranteed us in the RFP or RFQ?
I mean, I think it's a good question, and ultimately everyone bears a little bit of responsibility, I think, in all, governance situations. But I do think the buck stops ultimately with the government in terms of making sure when you're dealing with taxpayer dollars in particular, whether it comes from provincial or federal sources or whether it comes from property tax revenues or other mechanisms, it's at the end of the day, it's your job to spend the money effectively, and to use it wisely, and to also determine and set those taxation levels too. So I think, businesses absolutely have a role to play in Canada, as do individuals. But, ultimately municipal governments and other levels of government, the buck stops with them, and they are ultimately the ones who are accountable to the people, in terms of what you're spending and what you're doing, with that money. So I think that's really, where I would stand on that issue in particular.
The report highlights the real person spending has grown over 25% over the last 25 years or 23 years from when the report time frame ends in 2023. In your view, has that translated, in the Fraser Institute's view, has that translated into better outcomes for Canadians and our municipalities? And if not, which I'm assuming it will be that answer, how do we change that? How do we get the better service? Because the buck does stop here. People get elected. We have a municipal election here in the province of Alberta coming up, in Newfoundland and Labrador coming up. Next year, we see municipalities heading to the election polls. Is the residents need to sort of keep the politicians honest about how they're spending the hard-earned tax dollars that we send them?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. I mean, I think, when we're looking at value for tax dollars in particular, I think the municipal governments have a lot of the same problems that the provinces and the federal government has. And that the common narrative is to continually, well, if services aren't improving, well, let's just throw more money at the problem. So we see this at the provincial level with education and healthcare. Okay, our education outcomes aren't improving, our wait times are getting longer in healthcare. So ultimately, the solution is to maintain the status quo, double down, and increase government spending quite rapidly, and that'll make the problem magically go away. But ultimately, it is actually about spending the money very effectively and efficiently, and also not getting distracted in trying to, go beyond what your actual scope of government is. Try to do a few things well rather than trying to do 25 different things, only mediocre. And I think that's one of the big problems right now. So a lot of municipalities are delving into different things that kind of go beyond what they maybe should be dabbling in. And rather than focusing on critical infrastructure and trying to get that done really, really well, then we ultimately aren't refocusing the spending where our priorities are not in the right areas. And then we also have, sometimes even just contributing to problems rather than actually solving them. If we're looking at the housing sector, for instance, development charges have become a huge revenue source for a lot of municipalities, which just adds to the cost of housing. And then they're increasing spending to try to subsidize people and try to help them in the housing sector, even though they're being part of the problem on the revenue side. So I think, it is about taking a step back for a lot of municipal governments and actually realizing, what should we actually be doing? What's in the scope of, municipal government finances? Are we actually administering taxes properly? Are we actually spending the money effectively? Rather than constantly saying, we need more money, this is the only way we're actually going to solve these problems. Because it really hasn't actually solved any problems over the last, 10 to 15 years, I would say, when we look at service delivery and service value.
You talk about development charges, and I see that topic a lot in a lot of municipalities right now. Municipalities have to run balanced budgets at the end of the year. They have deficits, which they do, but they're debentures, and they have to balance that at the end of the year. So when a new project comes online, a new subdivision opens up, those development charges go towards, or are supposed to go towards, and I say that respectfully, knowing that not all the time they do, but they're supposed to go to putting in the infrastructure, the roadways, the sewers to those new developments. If we reduce those development charges to reduce the cost of housing, where should municipalities make up that funding to potentially see new housing built? Because the federal government, the provincial governments, the territorial governments are all saying we need to build housing faster. If the municipality reduces their funds with development charges, where should they make it up?
So it's a great question. So I would say, the common, thing that you probably hear a lot from municipal governments and mayors and city councilors is, when we reduce the development charges, where's the money coming from? And I would say, I would flip the question and say, instead of looking for new sources of revenue, you should actually be reprioritizing spending and getting that back into a balanced budget situation. And I think that's the problem. I mean, it's the same problem at the provincial and federal level right now in Canada. It's always about finding new sources of revenue rather than actually looking at, how much we're actually spending and are we actually spending that effectively? So, the cases I was talking about with fiscal waste, well, why not start there? Why not start targeting that? Why not also see, do we have too many bureaucrats and city administrators, more than we actually need? Because in many cases, we may actually be spending a lot more on those initiatives than what we should actually reasonably be doing regarding how much we're actually collecting in municipal revenue too. Because if your primary source of revenue is property taxes, and then you're also getting money from provinces and federal government, you probably shouldn't be having to rely too much on development charges to actually raise this revenue. So you're likely actually digging yourself a big hole if you're just spending a whole lot of money and then hoping that the development charges are going to make up the difference. So really, it should be an examination on the other side of the ledger, on paring back government spending at the municipal level, when we're already at or near record levels.
Very off the cuff question, but I think it's an important one in this context. Do we have too many municipalities in the country of Canada?
It's a good question. I mean, I haven't done a whole lot of research, but in this specific area, but I've been quite intrigued. There's a lot of conversations, particularly in Ontario, about amalgamation that comes up a lot. So there
The
is,
only
a
the
lot
only
of.
reason I asked that, and I apologize to interrupt, the only reason I asked that is because we are duplicating services across Canada right now. Here in Alberta, in Saskatchewan, with Saskatchewan has 700 municipalities. We could do a whole hour just on that if we wanted to. But in Canada, it seems like we duplicate services for our neighbors down the street. I'm in Calgary. I believe you're in Calgary as well. The and I know Mayor Brown, I know Mayor Thorne, I know Mayor Dean from Chestermere, Okotoks, and Airdrie. I'm going to get strongly worded emails about this, but why are they doing the same services that Calgary is doing? Why can't we work together, amalgamate into the region of the CRBM, whatever you want to call it, to offer services? Because I'm assuming that's how you could quickly lower expenditures across the board.
Yeah, so I think it's a really good question. And I think, I point out there's probably trade-offs that people consider in this situation. So amalgamation probably, leads to better outcomes in terms of efficiency and effectiveness because you're able to get that economies of scale, so to speak. And then I think on the other side, why people might be against it too, would be the fact that they want to experiment and try different things. They don't want a one size fits all approach necessarily. So this is, a similar argument to, the federal government having more powers than provinces, for instance, versus having, 10 provinces who administer 10 different healthcare and education systems. There's going to be benefits and there's going to be disadvantages to that approach. Whereas approach in the United Kingdom, for instance, where they have a unitary government and it's only one central government with, municipalities underneath it. is again going to have those benefits and trade-offs because it's a one-size-fits-all approach, which probably gives you those economies of scale and efficiencies, but it doesn't allow you to actually experiment with different approaches and see which is the best approach over time. So I think, there are trade-offs to amalgamation. So I think that's probably, where a lot of the debate goes here in terms of whether that's a good idea for people to pursue at the municipal level.
Are we painting a broad stroke with this report? Are we saying that all municipalities are under this challenge? Because the waste that we see in Calgary, and I'm a Calgarian, and I always ask, am I getting the services that I deserve with the taxes that I pay when I get my property taxes? But if I go to small town Alberta today, where they have one staff member in their office working for as their planning department, their CAO, their finance department, the communications X, Y, and Z, is this report painting a broad stroke, or do you believe that you're pointing it at the direct people that you need to be pointing it to?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really important point to make because there's a lot of differences between municipalities, even within a province itself, like Alberta. I mean, Calgary and Edmonton are quite different than Red Deer. They're quite different than Medicine Hat, Lethbridge, any of the small rural municipalities as well. So all of these different areas are going to have unique challenges to them. So the report is mainly just looking at national scope, saying these are the trends over time. By no means are we saying, this is happening in every place or every city, every municipality, every province across the country. It's just here's the overall trends for municipal government spending as a whole, to kind of give us that 10,000 foot view, so to speak, of municipal government finances in Canada. And then the important thing from there is then to start to zero in on different provinces, different municipalities, and how these trends are shaping up. Because there's likely, a lot of municipalities that are doing a lot better than others, not only on a service delivery, but a value for money in terms of how much they're taxing versus how much they're spending. So there's all of these different differences between urban versus rural municipalities. All of them have different needs, and I think that's an important aspect to include in this. All this report is simply showing is, here are the trends for Canada as a whole. Here's kind of the direction we've been heading. Is this approach actually working for Canada? And what do Canadians think about the value for services that they're receiving in their own respective municipalities?
So how do we do better? How do municipalities do better at the end of the day? Because we are heading into elections, as I've mentioned before in the interview so far. How do municipalities, because at the end of the day, the voters technically have the role to change the direction of the municipality if they don't believe they are getting the best service for their tax dollars. What can the municipalities, what can residents do to ensure that fiscal health and fiscal responsibility is on the ballot box when we come to October 20th, 2025?
Yeah, I think there's really three things that they should focus on, and which is first to eliminate fiscal waste. So doing a spending review, I think would be a really good place to start for a lot of Alberta municipalities in particular. I think the second thing too is better controlling costs over time too. Doesn't mean that costs can't ultimately grow over time, but they need to grow sustainably. And I'd argue right now, when you're growing faster than your population and inflation over the last number of decades, that's not at a sustainable pace. So yes, you've had, this boost in development charges and property taxes and other things that are kind of keeping you afloat right now. But that's not going to last forever. And that's not a trend that we can keep up. So controlling costs. So that part of that would be that spending review. And the last thing is really reprioritizing your focus as municipal governments on critical infrastructure. So, I probably don't need to tell you, but about the situation that happened with the water infrastructure in Calgary over the last, year or two. I don't think there was enough attention actually focused on that by municipal councilors and the mayor and other policymakers in that area. So really putting the focus back onto the critical infrastructure, not trying to have 25, 30 different priorities. Really stick to 5 to 10 things that you can do well and do them really effectively. I think that's the really important thing for municipal governments to take going forward, is to eliminate waste, control costs, and refocus the money spent on critical infrastructure to do that well.
So you mentioned the water main. I'll play in that sandbox for a second, if you don't mind, because we are seeing the aging of infrastructure being a top priority for a lot of municipalities right now. 20 years ago, you would often see, and I just did an editorial on this where I deep dove into the sins of the past, where municipalities from time to time would pass 0% tax increases because they wanted to toe the fiscal line. But now we are seeing that come back and bite municipalities in the behind a little bit because we don't have the critical infrastructure. They weren't asset management, they weren't planning for the future. How do we get our heads around going back to the basics? Because I think that's where this report is coming down to is municipalities need to get back to the basics. Are you hoping that we can get there, or is this just the first step in an ongoing discussion the Fraser Institute wants to have around getting back to municipal basics of wastewater, garbage pickup, road pavements, potholes in the summer, and barbecues in the summer months of Canada Day?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is the first point in the discussion about, what are the functions of a municipal government and what do we actually want them to be doing? Especially, when we have a division of powers between municipal governments, provinces, federal government. There's kind of been some confusion between all the different levels of government. I mean, you look, all three are basically involved in the housing sector. The federal government's now getting into provincial areas of jurisdiction, whether it's childcare, dental care, pharmacare, all of these different aspects. And it really blurs the lines of accountability over time too, I think. When there's, it's okay to have, provinces and municipalities work together. They ultimately share some similar functions, and that's kind of an unavoidable situation with how our constitution's set up, and that's perfectly fine. But I do think it harms in the long run democratic accountability and transparency if you're not really sure who's actually responsible for what, and who's actually, making mistakes or who's doing things right, who's making better decisions than others. And I think that's a big problem right now. So I think municipal governments refocusing their priorities on their core functions. I think the federal government's going through something similar right now too, where they're revisiting, how we spend military money, for instance, which is one of their core functions as a government too, and making sure that they do those, like I said before, those 5 to 10 things that are their core functions really well, and reprioritizing this instead of getting into a whole bunch of different areas where the lines of accountability are blurred between different governments.
What role does the province have to play in ensuring fiscal responsibility happens at the municipal level? Because Minister Williams, the new Minister of Municipal Affairs, is out touring and speaking to municipal leaders. What should he be talking to municipal leaders about I should say, in the province of Alberta? Other municipal affairs ministers are different names. So, in the province of Alberta, what should the province be doing to ensure that? Because we're seeing an increase in grants going to municipalities as well from the provincial and federal government. Your report outlines it as well. What should the province be do? What should they be doing to ensure that the money they're giving to the municipalities are spent wisely?
It's a good question. I mean, because one of the things that we've seen is that grant money, like you mentioned, from the provinces and federal government has increased over the last, 10 to 20 years. And it's coming at a time, when provinces and the federal government are running deficits and they're borrowing money, so they can't sustainably increase the spending either. So one of the things they have to do for starters is communicate to the municipalities that there's only one taxpayer. At the end of the day, we have huge fiscal challenges, not just at the municipal level, but also at the provincial and federal levels, which is one of the reasons why we have to ensure that we're spending money a lot more effectively and efficiently at all levels of government, because we can't sustainably continue the trends that we've done for the last 10 to 20 years. And does become difficult too, because ultimately you probably don't want the provinces to have too much say over what's going on at the municipal level. You want the mayors and councillors and other policymakers in the local governments to make those decisions, because they're best suited to know the unique needs of their own citizens in their own cities. So it is a little bit of this balancing act where, provinces do have to communicate that they don't just have endless money to give to municipalities, while at the same time allowing municipalities to experiment and make these different decisions that suit their own needs over time. So it is a bit of a tightrope act, so to speak. But I do think that the provinces do need to show more leadership in terms of communicating. We can't continue to just increase grants at the rate that we have been, and same with the federal government. So municipal governments are going to have to get their own finances in order. They're going to have to make difficult decisions. This is not going to be an easy process. And one of the things the provincial government can do is show their own leadership, and get their own fiscal house in order too, to show that the municipalities need to do that, because it can't just be, oh, you do this and we'll continue down the path that we're going on. It has to kind of be a collective effort from the provincial and municipal governments at the same time.
while it has to be a collective effort, which I completely agree, it has to be a collective effort on the financial front. It also has to be a collective effort on the infrastructure front as well. The current mayor of Lloydminster, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Gerald Elbers, often says this on the show that municipalities are responsible for 60% of the infrastructure in the province of Alberta today. That's over half of the infrastructure. That's roads, sewers, that's highways, that's everything you think of as falls under the role of municipalities. Is there a role that the province has to collaborate with the municipalities to ensure that what we are funding is funding adequately and not just doing it off the side of a desk and saying, okay, we're going to just patch it until it gets really bad and fix it once instead of three times? Because I think there's a concern in a municipality world right now that we are only patching the issues and not actually truly fixing the issues.
Yeah, I think that's certainly, a concern that we have to do. I mean, I do think we definitely need more coordination between provinces and municipalities over time on a lot of these critical infrastructure projects. I mean, if we look at the Green Line project, for instance, in Calgary itself, I mean, I don't know how long this project has really gone on for now. I know maybe 12, 13 years or something like that since they begun discussing it. But every time there's a regime change, municipally, provincially, federally, it seems like we kind of reset the clock on a lot of these things. And I think that needs to be revisited in terms of, the funding model, the governance model that we use for these different critical infrastructure projects. And there needs to be not only more coordination, but a lot more clarity and transparency over the processes, which I think would help a lot when it comes to these issues. And these are not going to be easy challenges to overcome over time. But ultimately, it probably does make the case that, makes sense that municipalities have these critical infrastructure projects. Because generally you want, governments to be the closest possible to the citizens to understand their challenges. So municipal governments have a lot more benefits than, provinces or federal governments, which are a little bit more removed from those unique local challenges that people have. But it is going to require some changes in thinking by municipal governments, federal governments, provincial governments over time. We can't just continue down this track of maintaining the status quo and then hoping the problems are going to go away. It is going to require a lot more collaboration and coordination among them.
So before I let you go, I have one open-ended question because I'm very cautious of time, but I should mention to my listeners, to my viewers, to the people watching this on TV across Alberta, Saskatchewan right now, if you want to read the report, it will be in the show notes. Head over to Cross Border Interviews, click on the links for this episode, and you will find the link to the official report. We'll also link the Fraser Institute's news release and the backgrounder of this report in our website. So I recommend that you check it out so you can do the research for yourself as well. But my last question for you here, Jake, and it's an important one. What haven't we talked about this report that you want to make sure the people of Western Canada and people who are listening to this across Canada on podcast platforms understand about what this report is trying to accomplish?
Yeah, I think I would point out a few things. Some of the narratives from, I've seen this time and time again from municipal policymakers is that, they're running short on money. And there certainly are financial pressures, but when we actually look at, revenues on a per person basis, they're actually increasing faster than spending currently. So it's not the case that, municipalities haven't had property tax revenue or they haven't had grant revenue coming in or they haven't had, sales of goods and services coming in. So they do have unique challenges in terms of budgetary pressures, as a lot of these services are being administered, like we've talked about municipally. But it's really important to look at both sides of the ledger when we're talking about revenue and spending. You're being squeezed, but so are other levels of government right now in Canada. And we need to have this conversation as a country, as municipalities, as citizens, about what we want our governments to actually do, how we want them to do it, and how effectively they should be doing it as well. Because I think a lot of the times we get lost in the weeds about these conversations about, yes, we need infrastructure, but how do we actually do it, and what's the right way to do it? And a lot of those conversations aren't necessarily had. I think at length with many people. They're not actually aware of what goes on in government, how it functions, which different levels of government are responsible for which services, and ultimately the taxation powers that they have to them. So I think part of this too is also just about civic education and increasing people's awareness about what they actually want from their governments.
I couldn't agree more around more civic engagement and education around our levels of government, even with some mayors, councillors, MLAs, premiers, and prime ministers and ministers that I know should have a basic understanding on what level of government does what in today's world. But here we are in 2025 and we're still having that conversation. Jake, I want to thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for sitting down with me for the last half hour to dive deep into this. I feel like we've scratched the surface. Next time that the Fraser Institute puts out a report around municipalities, be sure and be prepared for another quick interview with me. So thanks so much.
Wonderful. Well, thanks very much for having me on the show. It was great talking with you.
Thank you so much for tuning in for another episode of Municipal Affairs. Now, to read the report in its full, please head over to our website at crossborderinterviews.ca and click on this episode's links because you will find the links to that report in the show notes. Or if you're watching this on YouTube or in any podcast platforms, be sure to go down to the show notes and you can find the reports there. Also, if you're watching this or listening to this on any of your favorite podcast platforms, be sure to hit the subscribe button so you never miss an upcoming episode. Now, to learn more about the communities and the people that we feature on this show and our sister shows, visit us online at crossborderinterviews.ca. Your support means the world to us. So if you can, share this episode with your friends, your family, and yes, even your community, and help keep the conversation going. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and we'll be back with a brand new episode of Municipal Affairs shortly. Till then, everyone.